Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really fascinating intersection of physics and medicine.
Yeah, we're looking at hyperbaric oxygen, or HBO, and how it might, give radiation therapy a real boost in fighting cancer.
Exactly. You've asked us to cut through the complexity here, get to the heart of it, and that's our mission today. We're drawing on a whole lot of research.
And the central challenge really is something called tumor hypoxia,
Right.
basically low oxygen levels within tumors. And this lack of oxygen, well, unfortunately, it can act kind of like a shield,
Making radiation less effective.
far less effective at
Mm.
destroying those cancer cells.
Yeah. Okay, so the core problem is this oxygen deficit messing with radiation's power. And the potential, maybe game changer, is this hyperbaric oxygen.
Mm,
We're talking about giving oxygen under increased pressure, right? Hoping to flood those oxygen-starved tumor areas.
exactly. The idea is to make them more vulnerable to the radiation. It's all based on some pretty compelling research over the years.
And it's not entirely new, is it? I remember reading something about the history here.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Scientists first recognized this link between oxygen and how well radiation works way back in, I think, 1910.
Wow, okay.
And then the specific idea of using HBO in cancer treatment that started taking shape more in the 1950s.
Okay, let's really dig into this hypoxia thing then. Why do tumors get these low oxygen zones in the first place? What causes that?
Well, there are several factors at play, really. Tumors often grow their own blood vessels, but the network is usually pretty chaotic.
Not like normal tissue.
No, poorly structured, inefficient at delivering oxygen. Plus, you often see anemia in cancer patients.
Ah, right. So the blood itself carries less oxygen.
Exactly. And then there's the physical structure of the tumor itself. Tomlinson and Gray described this corded structure idea.
Corded structure.
Yeah, imagine cells growing outwards from a blood vessel. The ones furthest away get starved of oxygen, some might even die off, leaving these, like, rings of living but hypoxic cells around the vessels.
So how low are we talking? How significant is this oxygen drop?
It can be quite traumatic. Oxygen tension, the measure we use, can plummet to as low as 8 millimeters of mercury.
Okay.
And in the very center, the necrotic parts, it can even hit 0.
Zero oxygen. Wow. And the impact on radiation.
It's huge. When oxygen's scarce, those cancer cells can become up to 3 times more resistant to radiation damage.
3 times. That's massive. It's like they can just shrug it off much more easily.
Pretty much like holding their breath and weathering the storm, as you said.
So obviously HBO is one potential answer we're exploring today, but what other ways are scientists trying to tackle this hypoxia problem?
Oh, there's a whole range of strategies.
Okay.
One common one is radiation fractionation.
Doubling the dose.
Exactly, giving smaller doses over time.
Mhm.
The hope is that some tumor cells might reoxygenate between treatments, making them more sensitive next time.
Okay.
Then there's research into artificial oxygen carriers, things that can carry more oxygen in the blood, ways to make hemoglobin release its oxygen more easily,
Right.
and developing specific drugs called hypoxic cell sensitizers,
Mhm.
things like metronidazole, bisolanazole. They either mimic oxygen or specifically target those low oxygen cells.
And just treating the anemia itself, I suppose.
Absolutely. That's another important piece of the puzzle.
Right, so HBO fits into this broader picture. Let's focus back on that combination, HBO and radiotherapy. What's the basic scientific thinking behind putting them together?
The fundamental idea is pretty straightforward, actually. We know these hypoxic, oxygen-starved cells are more resistant to radiation.
Right.
So if we use HBO to boost the oxygen levels inside the tumor,
You make those resistant cells more sensitive again.
precisely, you're basically reducing their ability to repair the damage the radiation causes. The more cells we can stop from reproducing, the better the chance of treatment success.
Now, I seem to recall there was some maybe skepticism or caution around this approach early on.
That's right. Back in the 70s, you had researchers like Glassburn and his group urging a bit of caution.
Why was that?
They basically argued, look, it hasn't been definitively proven that radiation with HBO is better than just really well-done conventional radiotherapy. They stressed the need for, really rigorous controlled studies.
Especially in early stage disease.
Yeah, they pointed out even a small survival improvement would be significant then. But on the other hand, you had researchers, particularly in Russia, like Sergeyev's team, who were much more enthusiastic.
What were they seeing?
They were reporting increased damage to the tumors, lower recurrence rates using HBO, and importantly, they said, without seeing more cancer spread elsewhere. So yeah, definitely different viewpoints early on.
Okay, so a spectrum of opinion. How do we actually measure if HBO is, making a positive difference? What are the key things to look at?
Well, we often talk about the therapeutic ratio and also therapeutic efficiency.
Therapeutic ratio.
Yeah,
That's like the balance between hitting the tumor and harming healthy tissue.
exactly.
Yeah.
You want the treatment to be much tougher on the cancer than the normal cells nearby. The hope is HBO widens that gap, more tumor kill, without proportionally more damage to healthy tissue.
Makes sense.
It seems generally easier to achieve that in smaller tumors, interestingly. There's a potential issue where HBO can cause blood vessels to constrict slightly.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which could, paradoxically, limit oxygen delivery in some parts of larger tumors. It's complex.
And therapeutic efficiency.
That term often comes up when local heating, hyperthermia, is also used. Combining heat with HBO might enhance the local effects.
Got it. You also mentioned earlier that high pressure inside tumors can be a problem. How does HBO fit in there?
Yeah, that high interstitial pressure is a big hurdle. It can stop radiation and chemo drugs, too, from getting where they need to go effectively.
Right.
What's interesting is that HBO, maybe along with things like radiation itself or hyperthermia, seems to show some potential for actually reducing that internal pressure. The exact mechanism isn't fully pinned down, but if it lowers the pressure, it could potentially improve how well other therapies penetrate the tumor.
Okay. And what about this reoxygenation idea? You give a dose of radiation, maybe some cells get more oxygen afterwards. Does that negate the need for HBO?
Ah, that's a really critical question. And honestly, it's been debated a lot. Animal studies do show that if hypoxic cells persist, they can limit the treatment response.
But does that happen in humans after radiation?
That's been the uncertainty. Does the increased blood flow and reoxygenation that can happen after a radiation dose sort things out? It's tricky.
So how do we find out?
Well, newer tools are helping. Things called bioreducible markers. They can essentially light up or identify those viable living hypoxic zones within a tumor.
So you can see if they're still there after treatment.
Exactly. It helps us understand the dynamics better and maybe
Uh,
predict which tumors will be more resistant.
Okay, and just so everyone listening is clear, today we're focused on HBO helping to treat the cancer itself, right?
Mhm.
Not using it for side effects like radiation damage later on.
Absolutely correct. Using HBO for radiation necrosis, that tissue damage, is a whole separate important application. We've talked about that elsewhere.
Right.
But today, yeah, it's all about making those cancer cells more vulnerable to the radiation killing effect.
Okay, theory established. Let's move to the evidence. What did the lab experiments, the animal studies actually show?
Well, the preclinical stuff, it does offer some pretty encouraging signs. Studies in mice with mammary tumors, for instance, showed that even just breathing 100% oxygen at normal pressure helped.
Just normal pressure oxygen? Interesting.
Yeah. And then a really notable study by Brazel and colleagues, this was in rats, they compared HBO against carbogen, that's oxygen plus CO2, and also a drug, nicotinamide.
What did they find?
They found that HBO, either by itself or with a nicotinamide, significantly delayed tumor regrowth after radiation.
More so than the other approaches.
Yes, in their study, HBO was more effective than the carbogen and nicotinamide combo.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is that HBO seemed to help even in tumors that looked pretty well oxygenated to begin with.
Huh. So maybe it's not just about delivering more oxygen.
That's what it suggests. There might be other mechanisms at play beyond just fixing the hypoxia.
Okay. And I know there's a table in the research, table 38.1, summarizing a bunch of these experimental studies. Looking across them, what are the main takeaways?
Yeah, looking at that collection of studies, you definitely see a pattern. Increasing oxygen in the tumor, whether it's with HBO or other methods, generally seems to slow down tumor growth and boost radiation's effectiveness.
Through different mechanisms.
Seems like it. Some studies, like Fujimura's and ID's, showed it inhibited DNA synthesis in the cancer cells. Others, like Mieles and McDonald, demonstrated just an overall increase in radiation sensitivity.
And even effects on spread sometimes.
Yeah, some studies hinted at impacts on metastases too. So collectively, the animal work really suggests that tackling hypoxia fundamentally improves radiation outcomes in those models.
Okay, so promising in the lab. What about when we get to people? Clinical studies. Where has HBO shown success and where have things been, well, more complicated or controversial? Let's start with cervical cancer.
Right, cervical cancer. The clinical picture there has been a bit mixed, honestly. There was an early pilot study back in '65 that hinted at some benefit.
Particularly without internal radiation.
Yeah, when intracavitary radiation wasn't used. Then, a big trial by the MRC, the Medical Research Council, led by Watson in '78, That one reported better local control, better survival with HBO,
But mostly in certain patients.
especially younger patients, stage 2 disease, though they did note a slight uptick in radiation side effects.
Okay, so some positive signs, but with caveats.
But then, another MRC trial, this one by Dish and colleagues in '99, looked at more advanced stages, I and III.
Ah.
They found no significant benefit from adding HBO. And actually, there was some suggestion of increased late radiation problems in the HBO group, depending on the radiation schedule used.
So that really highlights the controversy, doesn't it?
It really does. It underscores how important the specific treatment details the protocols seem to be. And interestingly, a look back by Dish in '83 suggested that anemic patients getting blood transfusions in HBO seemed to do better locally.
So the different results might really hinge on things like the radiation schedule used alongside the HBO.
That seems very likely. The interaction between the fractionation scheme and the HBO seems critical in cervical cancer.
Okay. What about head and neck cancers? You mentioned earlier that might be a more positive story.
Yes, generally, head and neck cancer trials have shown more consistently positive results with HBO. There was a review by Lee and colleagues back in '96.
What did that cover?
They talked about the shift towards trying those hypoxic sensitizer drugs, but noted the results were kind of inconclusive. They also mentioned a drug called tirapazamine, which hits hypoxic cells harder.
But focusing on HBO.
Right. Numerous trials since the '70s have reported that adding HBO to radiotherapy improved local cancer control and also survival rates in head and neck patients.
Any ideas why it seems to work better there compared to, say, cervical cancer?
Well, the thinking is maybe it allows for a more uniform cancer cell kill because you get better oxygenation, better radiosensitivity throughout the tumor. And also, HBO might help with healing after surgery, which often follows radiation in these cases.
That makes sense. Maybe the baseline hypoxia levels are different, or the standard radiation protocols just mesh better with HBO's effects in these cancers?
Both are very possible explanations. Tumor biology and treatment standards definitely play a role in how well any adjunct therapy like HBO works.
Okay, and there's another table, 38.2, for head and neck clinical trials. What are the highlights there?
Yeah, looking across that table, you see quite a few studies pointing towards benefits. Glanzman saw better healing in advanced throat tumors. Seeley noted less local recurrence, longer lifespans in the HBO group.
Although you mentioned a higher death rate overall in that one.
Yes, that was a complex finding needing careful thought. Nelson and Holt found significantly better results combining radiotherapy, HBO, and heat therapy.
Heat as well. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Whittle showed significant improvement in local control for certain throat cancers. Hafty reported substantial improvements in response rates for advanced cases using HBO with a shorter, higher-dose radiation schedule.
So quite a few positive signals.
Definitely. And some studies even looked at using less radiation before surgery if HBO was given. The potential advantages there are shorter treatment, maybe better wound healing, less impact on the immune system.
So the overall picture for head and neck.
Overall, yeah, most studies do suggest some real advantage to adding HBO to radiotherapy for many head and neck cancers. Better local control seems common, and sometimes survival benefits too.
Okay, more promising there. What about other sites? Lung, bladder, melanoma, brain tumors. What's the story?
Okay, for lung cancer, there was that study by Cade and McEwen in '78. They found better survival in squamous cell lung cancer patients treated with larger, less frequent radiation doses plus HBO.
Okay, bladder cancer.
Less encouraging there, unfortunately. Kirk's study in '76 reported more early severe side effects, suggesting it was hard to get the full radiation dose in with HBO.
And the bigger MRC trial.
Cade's trial in '78 found no benefit and was stopped early. Interestingly, though, more recent work by Hoskin in '99 suggested carbogen, maybe with nicotinamide, gave better results than the older HBO trials in bladder cancer. So people are still looking for ways to target hypoxia there.
Right, melanoma.
Malignant melanoma. Seeley's group in '74 saw good responses in about half their patients, even some with metastases, using large radiation fractions in HBO. So a potential role there, perhaps.
And brain tumors, gliomas.
That's a complex area. A lab study by Buehler in 2015 showed HBO could reverse some radiation-induced cell movement. Clinically, Koshy did a pilot study in '96.
What did that show?
Significant tumor shrinkage. Better survival when radiotherapy was given immediately after HBO, compared to radiation alone. But then Bepu's study in 2003, adding HBO to a specific therapy for residual tumors. They saw good initial responses, but no overall survival increase in that very poor prognosis group. They called for a bigger randomized trial.
So still uncertain for gliomas.
The approach of radiating right after HBO seems safe, maybe effective, maybe even protective of normal tissue. But yeah, much more research is needed for those aggressive tumors.
Okay, so it really seems like a mixed bag depending on the cancer type and maybe the specifics of how it's used. Summing up then, what are the main advantages and the main limitations or drawbacks of using HBO in cancer treatment based on all this?
Well, on the plus side, HBO is probably the most powerful tool we have right now to directly counteract tumor hypoxia for radiosensitization. That's a key advantage.
Right.
Plus, it has that known benefit for treating radiation injury to normal tissues later on. And maybe using it up front could even prevent some of that late damage.
And the survival benefit seen in some studies.
Yeah, particularly in head and neck cancer, especially less advanced stages.
Hmm.
And we saw in animal models it boosts oxygen in bladder tumors, potentially helping chemo and radiation work better there.
Okay, but what about the downsides? The limitations?
Big one. It only really works if hypoxia is actually a significant problem in that specific tumor. If the tumor's well oxygenated, HBO probably won't add much benefit for radiosensitization.
Makes sense.
It doesn't seem effective against metastases, cancer that's already spread. And there's a theoretical worry, not really proven in humans, that it might even encourage metastatic growth in some situations.
Okay. Other limitations.
Well, if the tumor's blood vessels are totally blocked or shut down, HBO can't get the oxygen in. And completely wiping out tumors with large hypoxic areas without exceeding radiation tolerance is still a major challenge.
Any risks with HBO itself?
There is a risk of oxygen toxicity at the high pressures used, although we have ways to manage that. And it's not suitable for patients with acute radiation sickness.
And practically in the clinic.
A big challenge is timing. The boost in tumor oxygen levels after coming out of the chamber might only last, say, 5 to 10 minutes.
That's a very short window.
It is. It means you need incredibly tight coordination between the HBO session and delivering the radiation dose. Logistically tricky.
Yeah, those practical issues sound like real hurdles. So, given these limitations, what else is being explored? Alternative approaches, combinations maybe?
Oh, lots of things. Researchers are looking at anti-angiogenic therapy drugs that target the tumor's blood supply.
When would you use those relative to HBO?
It's generally recommended after HBO, plus chemo or radiation, so you don't hinder the oxygen or drug delivery during treatment. And importantly, there's no evidence HBO itself makes tumors grow more blood vessels.
Okay, what else?
There's hypoxia-activated gene therapy, still quite experimental. Special drugs, like modified kinones, that are only toxic in low oxygen conditions.
Targeting the hypoxia directly.
Exactly. Or even manipulating genetics, like downregulating something called miR-18A in lung cancer to make it more sensitive to radiation.
Fascinating. What about combining with heat or cold?
Right, hyperthermia heating. Cancer cells are often more sensitive to heat, and heat can improve oxygen delivery. Combining it with HBO and radiation could increase damage. Timing seems important. Maybe heating before radiation is better.
And cold. Hypothermia.
That reduces metabolism, oxygen use. Some studies combining it with HBO and radiation showed increased tumor response. But the logistics of safely cooling patients and the complications are major issues.
Okay. Any drug combinations?
Vasodilators, drugs to open blood vessels, have been considered, but there's a risk they might steal blood flow away from the tumor. Using them with HBO hasn't really been tested.
What about blood-related strategies?
Interestingly, inducing mild anemia in patients getting HBO actually seemed to improve radiotherapy in one cervical cancer study, and overcoming radiation resistance in anemic mice. So managing red cells, maybe transfusions, could play a role.
That seems counterintuitive, inducing anemia.
It does, but it might relate to complex effects on blood flow and oxygen release. It's still being researched. Also, combining HBO with those radiosensitizing drugs, nitroimidazoles, seems to boost their effect, maybe even more so if there's induced anemia.
And those artificial oxygen carriers.
For fluorochemicals, yeah. They dissolve lots of oxygen, especially under pressure. Animal studies showed they reduce hypoxic cells and enhance radiation. Fluazole-DA was one.
Was it used in humans?
A pilot study in glioma patients with HBO showed it was safe, but there were some adverse reaction reports later, so caution is needed. Another one, perfluoroalkyl bromide or oxidant, also looked promising in animal models.
HBO with standard chemo.
Lab studies suggest HBO might enhance drugs like 5-fluorouracil, maybe causing damage to mitochondria and cell membranes, but no major clinical trials combining them yet, as far as the research indicated.
And one more combination.
Photodynamic therapy, PDT, that uses light-sensitive drugs. Combining with HBO seems feasible. HBO might speed up the reaction by improving light penetration, oxygen supply.
Wow. Okay. So a huge range of combinations and alternatives being explored. It really shows how complex this is. Now, there was that review by Machune back in '97 looking specifically at those big MRC trials. What was their big picture conclusion?
Yeah, Machin and colleagues look back at over 30 years of those MRC trials, including ones using HBO. Their conclusion was that these trials were really crucial. They established the biological activity of different treatments and, importantly, helped figure out the right radiotherapy doses for certain cancers, like brain tumors.
So even if not every HBO trial was a home run, the overall research effort was valuable.
Absolutely. The collective knowledge gained from those rigorous studies significantly pushed our understanding forward.
So bringing it all together, what are the main takeaways about tumor hypoxia itself? Is it definitely real, and does it definitely matter?
The overwhelming evidence says yes, hypoxia is a real significant feature in many human tumors. And yes, it very likely contributes to treatment failure in some cancers, especially those squamous cell types.
But it's not uniform.
No, definitely not. The amount of hypoxia varies hugely between cancer types, even between tumors that look the same stage. And that variability probably explains why responses to hypoxia targeting treatments also vary so much.
And we're getting better at seeing it.
We are. Researchers are constantly developing better ways to detect and map these hypoxic zones. The hope is that leads to more personalized treatments down the line.
Okay. And finally, that systematic review by Bennett and colleagues in 2012, they looked across all the trials. What did they find?
Bennett's review found some evidence suggesting HBO improves local tumor control and maybe mortality in head and neck cancers. Also, maybe reduce local recurrence in both head and neck and cervical cancers.
But with caveats again.
Yes, they noted these potential benefits might be linked to specific, maybe unusual radiation fractionation schedules. And importantly, they also highlighted that HBO is associated with significant adverse tissue damage from radiation.
And the quality of the studies?
They cautioned that limitations in some of the studies meant the findings needed to be interpreted carefully, critically.
Right. So let's wrap this deep dive up. Hyperbaric oxygen. It clearly offers this compelling idea, doesn't it? Tackle hypoxia, make radiation work better, and it seems particularly promising in some areas like head and neck cancer.
Yeah, the potential is definitely there, but it's equally clear it's not some simple magic bullet. There's real complexity, ongoing research is vital to figure out how best to use it, and crucially, who is most likely to benefit.
Exactly. The aha moment for me is just realizing how something so fundamental like the oxygen level in a tumor can have such a massive impact on whether a treatment works or not.
It's profound, isn't it?
And for you, our listener, hopefully this gives you a clearer picture of a really cutting-edge area in cancer therapy. You can see the exciting potential, but also the very real challenges in taking discoveries from the lab to the clinic.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, the promising results, the limitations, the side effects, what future breakthroughs or maybe more personalized approaches could help us better use oxygen through HBO or maybe other methods to really shift the odds for cancer patients? And perhaps even more fundamentally, what is it about individual tumors that might predict one day who will respond best to these kinds of strategies?